Welcome, Rachel Holtzman, to Two Rabbis, Three Opinions. I think that's the name of the podcast, is it
Why
not?
not?
I
It's
think
really good. It should be if it's not.
we're gonna call it that. We're very excited to have you here and to join in this conversation about this book and about kind of the work that you are doing in general. We are recording this both on video and audio. Originally, Ari and I had the idea of having this just as an audio, but because we can do video, we're going to see and we'll see what we do. So, people, if you are seeing us, then we decided to do video as well.
And we're not
Uh,
wearing any makeup. I mean,
yeah, that's
yay.
right. That's right. Need just a little bit of cover. So, you are coming to us from St. Louis, and we are just delighted to talk to you about your role in Uncomfortable Conversations with the Jew and how it can be used as a meaningful tool for us to explore these issues and to deepen our own understanding of ourselves and perhaps others' understanding of us. So we just wanted to jump in, talk a little bit about why this book is important. Then we want to talk about you and your role in it, and then just let the conversation go as it will. And I just also wanted to say I'm very excited to be working with Rabbi Averbach, with Ari. We are friends, and we are both rabbis of different congregations in Thousand Oaks, and we've been looking for opportunities to do things together. We have congregations that have a lot that is similar and things that are very different about us, and the opportunity to join together, I think, is a wonderful thing that we want to model for the community. So let me just start by, this is Emmanuel Acho's second Uncomfortable Conversations book.
It's
Um,
third.
third,
Yes.
the
There
first one
was
was,
Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and which was followed by Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Boy.
I didn't know about the second book.
Yes, this is his third, which is like a companion to his online series, Uncomfortable Conversations with Emmanuel Acho.
So, what are uncomfortable conversations?
His idea is that in having conversations with someone who has had different experiences than you and educating yourself in that experience, that's really the only way that we can bridge gaps sort of in the human experience, and that there's a lot of assumptions that get in the way of our relationships with one another. We might intellectually know that we feel a kinship with someone who has a different experience than us, but our hangup can be not wanting to ask the difficult question or something that seems like it could potentially come off as being controversial or hurtful. And particularly with his first book, Comfortable Conversations with a Black Man, Emmanuel wanted to confront those questions head on and ask them. He, polled friends and acquaintances, what would you ask if you didn't have to worry about those things? And also filled in some of the blanks, acknowledging what the elephants in the room were, but that were equally as important to understanding what his experience as a Black man is. Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew is a continuation of that concept. And so it was him who approached Noah to do the book, which I think is a really interesting piece of that puzzle.
Noah
Right.
is Noa Tishby, the
Yes.
the co-author. And what are the right titles? They are both co-authors, and what is,
Co-authors.
and you are a consulting author the way that Sherlock Holmes is a consulting detective.
I am in what's called a book collaborator, and the easiest way to describe it is like a ghostwriter who's credited for their work. But truly, my job is to come into a project and to help someone both shape and construct their book, usually because that person doesn't have the time to do it themselves, at least in terms of like putting pen to paper. It's usually a bandwidth issue. And in the case of this book, it was a time and bandwidth and logistics issue.
So how did they find you? Looking at your website, you have some incredible books. Most of them, I think, are food based,
Hmm.
right? Shaquille O'Neal's book about food. And I don't know, I feel like other people who are very notable for, I guess also, how did Shaq find you? But if your niche is like helping people who aren't authors write about food, and that's a lot of your work, how did two people who are not really writing about food, aside from one part about a soul food Shabbat dinner?
Sure.
You.
So I do quite a bit in food. That's absolutely correct. But I've always, running parallel to that work, have done quite a bit of narrative nonfiction. And it gets a little bit eclipsed by the food work because cookbooks are just innate to their construction. You can work on a lot more of them at one time.
Right.
And so there's a little bit more of a rhythm, and like purely by volume, the other narrative nonfiction kind of gets crowded out from that overall picture. So this kind of work has always been very important to me. But in terms of the genesis story of this book, I'd actually just been feeling for a little while that it had been a moment since I'd worked on a book that felt really substantive, really important. And I was bemoaning that fact to my husband, and he very sagely said to me, "Well, does anyone know that you feel that way?" And I said, "No, I would just much rather grouse about it to myself." And so I found myself in New York for a client and their book launch. And I took the opportunity to meet with some editors and agents who I hadn't seen in quite some time, and expressed to them that in addition to all of this food work, which I love and is so close to my heart, that I'd really love to be considered for more of these really juicy narrative nonfiction projects. And I landed back in St. Louis and had a voicemail from the editor, Doris Cooper, who had signed this book up actually over a year prior to this conversation, which I'll get into. But um, this was November 2023. So this was a very specific moment in time. And she had signed up this book 15 months prior. And at that time, it was, as I described, Emmanuel wanting to continue this uncomfortable conversation series. He had approached Noa, who was perfectly positioned to do it, because for anyone who isn't familiar with her work, she's really centered it around um, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism advocacy. And in the wake of October 7th, she had really emerged as this very loud, clear voice who was narrating this experience for not just Jews, but certainly the Jewish community. But to not get ahead of myself, so for 15 months, this had sat and had kind of inched forward, and Emmanuel and Noah knew exactly what they wanted to do with the book. They had a really clear vision of the topics that they wanted to tackle, what the basic construction of the book was going to be. But then October 7th happened, and Noah really felt pulled more towards the advocacy work that she was doing. There was so much news coming out at once. She was helping to make sense of everything that was coming out of Israel for an American audience, and she was doing a ton of speaking. And so the question became twofold of, how do we get this book done? And also, how do we get this book out as quickly as possible? That was the real imperative, because our editor, Doris, is Jewish, and as were a number of other people at the publisher who understood that it was just, there was so much importance to have this book in hand right now. But the thing to understand about publishing is that it is an archaic industry, and it's still a it's a it is a paper product. It is something that needs to be manufactured. So just the publication process, forgetting even just writing a book, that book has to be edited, it has to be copy edited, it has to be fact checked, in this case, meticulously. You also have to be able to craft a publicity and marketing campaign around it, which requires a certain amount of advanced planning. The book has to be physically printed. It's being shipped back and forth from China on a boat, because that is how it is done. And then it has to be distributed to all the booksellers. So that alone takes about 9 months. And it's very difficult to truncate that process, because you don't want to sacrifice any element of it. So the one thing you can sacrifice is how long it takes to write the book. And on average, books take about 9 months to write a book. And they said, you have one. But we all felt called to meet that challenge. So, but to backtrack a little bit, how they found me is that this is my work. This is my domain. This is what I do. I call myself a book doula. I'm here to facilitate the process for my clients to take these ideas that they have been incubating, that they've been living with in their minds, and to help take those ideas, translate them to the medium, which in this case is books, and to do it with the most integrity to their voice and their vision and their worldview. And that's what they really needed in this moment, was someone who could navigate that really efficiently, and not just for one person, but for two. So, Yeah, that was the gauntlet that had been thrown.
But it also seems like the level of emotion and passion and pain were extraordinary. I mean, I think we all felt it. There are some kind of wonderful, powerful, painful sections about Noah streaming live during October 7th and the interactions between her and Emmanuel. There was just a lot of pain in the beginnings of this book. How did you navigate that as well?
It's true. This was very raw, and we were navigating a landscape on top of it. When I described what the initial intent of the uncomfortable conversations process of, this is for people who aren't Jews to understand the Jewish experience. And what we were seeing unfold day to day was that willingness to understand the Jewish experience, that window was getting narrower and that land wasn't feeling as fertile in terms of where we could plant seeds. So we were having to examine who is this book for, first and foremost, while also really holding this incredibly painful experience that we were all in the very brief wake of, or the short aftermath of. But we had to look that in the face that, we had these hopes, of course, that we would be constructing something that would be maybe a candidate for course adoption, that would maybe help people um, kind of loosen their grip on some of these ideas that really had come to the forefront in terms of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiment in the wake of the seventh, and give people more of a framework for understanding why the things they were saying were hurtful, while also acknowledging the reality that that may not happen. When I'm normally, to give you some context, when I'm normally writing a book, my world is very small. It's me and my client. And I understand that the editor needs certain things in order to publish that book to great success. And the publisher has their vision. And there's a literary agent representing me, there's one representing my client, but they really leave us alone. We have a lot of space to just be and create. And then we let people in incrementally. Because this had to be done so quickly, and because it was so imperative that the greatest number of points of view were represented and thought of and considered. It was sort of by committee. So we had our editor, we had literary agents on both sides. There were the two clients. There were then trusted acquaintances of the authors. So when I say we, it was a much larger group than usual. But what we all were realizing, particularly the Jews among us, is that there was so much education that we still wanted and needed, because in the wake of the seventh, there were so many conversations that we wanted to have and yet felt really stymied by not having the language to have them. So for me, the North Star really became, how can we help the Jews that are coming to this book become conversant in these issues? And conversant being the real operative word, because we not only wanted them to intellectually understand who they are and why they are and all the things that go into being who they are, but to be able to speak to them, because those are two very different processes. So it couldn't just be an intellectual exercise.
Who do you see this book for?
It's certainly been for a Jewish audience, and I've loved watching a Jewish audience read this book and experience this book and feel so empowered in terms of their knowledge of self. And I think also having someone okaying what they believe to be true, because, the elephant in the room is Zionism and Israel and all these things that the book talks about. But there has been, certainly since 2023, all of this dust kicked up that called into question almost the validity of our own experience and our own identity, no matter where you fell on the religious spectrum, or Jewish identity spectrum. And what I love about this book is that it allows people to see themselves in that experience and okays that and says that what you feel is valid and what you feel is true. And then conversely, I've had a large number of non-Jews read this book and, come to me mouths agape, because they had no way of understanding the complexity of the Jewish experience. It's not just eating challah and the Holocaust. There's so much more that goes into it. This is thousands of years of context, of historical, political, religious, geographical context.
Yeah, I
And
was on the phone yesterday with a guy, and I just wanted to recommend. I said I have a book to recommend to you because he called to essentially say that Israel has no historical this whole, all the talking points that the book goes into. I was like, I have a book for you to read. If you want to look at this book, was there ever a different version of the book, either not in dialogue form or a
mm,
different title? Like, was it with a Zionist, with an Israeli, with all the
mm,
different adjectives you could put on Noa Tishby?
yeah.
Because she says at the beginning of the book, like, she's not a very knowledgeable Jew. And so to say that these are conversations with a Jew and she's representing Judaism as opposed to, I don't know, a rabbi, somebody who's like really learned, and
Yeah.
she's representing Judaism and going, yeah, there's a lot of things I don't know, but Israeli history is my
Yes.
bread and butter.
Yes. Well, originally it was uncomfortable conversations with a Jewish woman to run parallel to Black man. And that was really interesting because then we're like, are we leaving a certain segment of readership out? Because, whether you like it or not, a male audience might feel less inclined if they're like, oh, this is just like a woman's perspective. And unfortunately, that's just like kind of where we're at. And then it became, this is really just like a marketing exercise at this point of what's going to stand out to readers. And then Noah proposed uncomfortable conversations with a Jew. And it made everyone really uncomfortable. And it was a really neat process because we're like, why is it making us so uncomfortable? Because that is exactly who we are. And it became this reclamation of Jew. I'm a Jew. And the only reason why it sounds negative to our ears is because there's been thousands of years worth of people making it sound really negative to our ears. So, to your point of who is this individual who is standing as representative of this experience, that was really a challenge of this writing exercise because I saw my role as, we have Noah and her expertise, and we have Emmanuel and his expertise. And then there was the conversation, which really was this third party, this third entity. And that's where I saw myself in terms of my responsibility and like my purview because it needed to just following the ebb and flow of the exchange of those ideas and figuring out where we were going to land so that it felt instructive and accessible to a reader. There were moments where Noah would readily admit, let's talk to a rabbi about this piece. There was a tremendous amount of research that went into it, which is another reason why it boggles my mind that we were able to do it so quickly because I am not by any means a scholar if you pick any one chapter, the Holocaust is one chapter. The entire history of Israel is one chapter. Judaism is one chapter. And each of those things could easily be an entire degree of study. So there was a tremendous amount of research. Again, why it felt so imperative to have this panel of individuals who are looking at the book, also non-expert panel. So this was a group of Jews and non-Jews. So to your question of like, was there ever another iteration of the book was constantly evolving because what would happen is I went out to LA early on in the process, which is what I typically do. I spend a nice chunk of time, uninterrupted time if possible, with my clients so that they can really get into a flow and they can sort of alleviate themselves of all these ideas that they've been sitting with in their brain for however long they've had the idea to write this book. And then I take that and I'm able to fill in the blanks and cobble things together and go back to them with questions. So we did that initial download in LA and then I went back home. So we were constantly having to keep tabs on, are we talking to, again, like, is this for a Jewish audience? Is this for a non-Jewish audience? And it had to be like, it had to kind of satisfy the thirst of a Jewish audience and be nuanced and like detailed and academically founded enough while also not being completely boring to a non-Jew. And there were times where Emmanuel was like, I zoned out 3 paragraphs ago. And he wasn't being a jerk. It was true. If this is not your experience, you're not bringing that same sense of emotional urgency to something even as a reader, it's not going to appeal to you in the same way you're kind of not innately not willing to like do the same amount of work. And so that became the imperative at every step was to really pare things down whenever possible. And then on the back end, we engaged There were two rabbis who vetted it. There was a fact checker from the New Yorker. There were two Middle Eastern studies experts. There was a journalist whose beat had been um, the Middle East for, I think, the entirety of their career. So it was like very thoughtfully combed through, but it was constantly taking shape in terms of how can we best serve this material while also meeting the need of someone to actually understand it.
I'll tell you one of the things that I am both interested in and excited about. I wish that we had proceedings of the conversations that led to the production of the book. Because in some way, I think that those conversations are where there's so much richness. One of the things that the book does, it kind of presents a perspective, right?
Mm,
Which I think is invaluable. And I think that we need to be able to have an understanding of a narrative. But behind those narratives, there's a lot of nuance and there's struggle and perspectives. And
yeah.
one of the things that Ari and I are hoping is that our congregants will be able to enter into that same type of discussion. So even though they're looking at the end notes of the book, there are all of these discussions that can flow out of that. Like, where does this come from? Where do we get this idea? How do we find out whether this idea is correct or not? And I think that that dialogue is equally important as the conclusions that are being brought here and the invitation to engage in further dialogue so that we can have a deeper understanding of what we mean by this. So that's, in some ways, I'm curious as to how you have used this book as a resource in the Jewish community.
I do not take lightly stepping out and speaking about work like this because I am not a credited author on this book. So the way that I hold that work is delicate because at no point am I holding it up and saying, look what I did. This is Emmanuel and Noah's book. The piece that I do feel comfortable inserting myself in is, like I said, the conversation and being representative of this middle point, this intersection of the two of them, and being able to hold that center and asking of both of them those critical questions so that we could get to this like sort of cohesive narrative with nice clean conclusions, because you're right, that is not what a conversation between two human beings ever looks like. So I was approached by my synagogue. This was the first piece that I put together, and I led a series. It was a 3-part series, and the directive was really open-ended. It was, can you come and talk about this book? Because people have read it or they want to read it, and they're just really hungry to talk about it. Because that's like anyone who reads this book just wants to talk about it. And the thing that interested me the most was exploring, how do you actually facilitate and take part in a conversation that feels satisfying and productive, particularly around these issues? And you're right that if there were transcripts of what the initial or original conversations look like, they would look a lot like conversations that we've had with anyone in our lives, about these issues or any others, where it's a really crowded room when you have a conversation with someone. It's never just the two of you. You're always bringing with you a lot of stuff, purely by just being born, who you're born and where you're born and the community that you are a member of. So, with Noah and Emmanuel, we had every dynamic on the table. We had race dynamics, gender dynamics, power dynamics, religious dynamics. And then you add socioeconomic dynamics. I mean, it was all there. And then you add anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism into the mix, and it's like juggling grenades. It's complicated. So what I then used the book as a platform for, both at my synagogue and then a couple organizations since have reached out, is helping people understand how they can both become really self-aware of the dynamics that they are bringing to the table, particularly if they're Jewish, because there's a lot that we carry with us from our experience that can become hindrances in these conversations, while also being aware of how someone else and their worldview and what their barriers to understanding might be, and how can we move towards, at the very least, a respectful understanding of one another, but ideally, how can we answer the question of where do we want to go from here? Because the conversations ultimately, I think, should be productive with an eye towards of what does the future hold for both of us? And what are the things that we both want? Where are the intersections in terms of what we both want? And we can rehash and we can argue and we can, try to parse the different realities that we both see, which has become increasingly complicated, or we can clear that away. Granted, people are not engaging in uncomfortable conversations, I think, as much as they'd like to. I think a
Right.
lot of us are walking around pumping ourselves up for like going to the grocery store and like picking out gefilte fish and someone calling us a Zionist and we're going to be ready and we're going to know what we want to say. Ultimately, that doesn't really happen a lot in our lives, but we're like preparing ourselves with this hypervigilance to like speak to that. And that the forum for these conversations is actually so much easier than that. And it's the people in our communities, it's people in the Jewish community, and it's the people that we just have daily interactions with that can be as simple as shopping at the grocery store and the cashier saying, "Oh, why are you buying all these groceries?" And the difference between saying, "Well, I'm buying them for Shabbat dinner for my family, or I'm making dinner tonight." And the way that we can move through spaces overtly Jewish and having ownership over that experience. And then just knowing, like in this very peaceful way, that like, should that conversation move further, that we can engage in it from a place that's really self aware and very understanding of that person's curiosity as well.
I wonder if people come at this or have different goals that can develop over time. Seems like one of the goals is to know that there is some reasonable answer to the challenges that people point at us. And that a deeper understanding might be to know that those answers are actually good answers or reasonable answers. A deeper understanding might be to kind of understand not only our good answers, but what are good answers on the other side, and how can we find that there is some deeper understanding that encompasses both our answers to something and someone else's answers. And I think that people can come to this book at their own level, at whichever level they choose to. But to the extent that we, as two congregations, as a community, using this tool, can work to deepen our own understanding of it, I think it's all for the better.
Hmm.
Um, are there ways that people can start at one level and then deepen their understanding using this book as a springboard rather than a final destination?
Um, well, I would love to clarify. Do you mean in terms of combating anti-Semitism? Do you mean like with what end do you
Yeah,
mean?
I mean, I think that first of all, part of it is about their own understanding of Judaism and their place in it. Part of it is their understanding of Israel and Zionism, where there's a lot of unclear feelings right now. The conflict between social justice at one level and Israel and Zionism at another level, which is portrayed as having a conflict. It's not clear whether that conflict is there the way that it's portrayed and why that idea has come about. I
Mm.
think that those are important things that we have to go through a process as we are kind of coming to deeper and deeper understandings of those issues.
Yeah. Well, I think the real power of the book is okaying the validity of the Jewish experience. The ultimate answers that were arrived at in the spaces in between and delivered to the reader are pretty objective. And we all wanted to make sure of that because that's how it becomes a real resource to as many people as possible. There had to be a center that was so rooted in research and in historical and geopolitical context that we could use that as like the core place to operate from. So our feelings around those things can be different, but in order for us to move from this place successfully, we have to hold a center of what is real, of what is factual. And unfortunately, that line feels like it's shifting all the time. And that just can't it just can't be. It is impossible. Yes, it's true that more than one things can be true at the same time, but they stem from these core facts, but there are core truths that exist here. And so I think sometimes when things get confusing, and we're trying to navigate them on our own or with someone else, we need to go back to these core truths that we understand, know that we can hold them as center. And then from that place, ask ourselves to be both vulnerable in hearing what other experiences or other understandings of truth might be and look at how they square with our understanding of it, and also asking that person, can they meet me where I am in terms of being able to hold perhaps two things as being true at once, and that your truth does not make my truth less valid. And then the other role that it plays in terms of having that core understanding is it gives a Jewish reader that little boost of confidence of your experience and the things that you believe to be true are coming from a place that are rooted in truth and validity.
So how did it work? Is there any point where they read what you wrote of their words and you're like, wow, that's not my voice, or I didn't say that?
Yeah, so the evolution started from them having conversations, and they did send me some recorded conversations that they had had prior to me being involved in the project. And then when I was out in LA, um, then I was able to be privy in real time to conversations that they were having. Were those the exact, like, literal prompts all the time? Not necessarily. We wanted to clarify, for the sake of content, what is the most effective question here, but it was all in service of those conversations. That was very real. And it was really interesting to hear what a black man from Texas, to get that perspective, to hear what even the questions were in the first place. And that then sometimes formed other topics that we felt like we had to get into, where Noah and I would be like, oh my gosh, like we totally took for granted that we had this understanding of X or Y. So they were very involved in the content at the end. It had to sound conversational, both in terms of structure and the back and forth, but also like in part in like its flow. I think really does feel like you're sitting in the room with someone.
Right. And some of what you just said, that there's certain things that he didn't know, is fascinating to me. And reading it as a Jew, part of me wishes the book was called Uncomfortable Conversations with somebody who knows nothing about Judaism, doesn't know Jews aside from like my agent is Jewish, and doesn't know anything about Israel. One of his opening statements, like on his second page of his introduction, is, did the post October 7th world make me feel like I, a black man, would be on the wrong side of history by helping a Jewish woman tell her story? No doubt about it. And at that point, I was like, I am not reading the book that I thought I was reading. This is from somebody who doesn't know anything. So it's interesting to watch him learn through the book as well.
I think some of the beauty of the book is, first of all, when you learn about yourself or your tradition in the presence of someone else, you just view it differently. All of a sudden, you hear things differently. That's one of the
Yeah.
reasons that interfaith dialogue can be really powerful.
Yes.
Um, I also think that the graciousness of Emmanuel Acho is just
Mhm.
something that I don't want to take away from, in the same way that the graciousness of the non-Jewish spouse who might be a member of our congregation and who also might be reading this. We hear things differently and we learn different ideas about ourselves. The idea of this as a book that someone who is interested in conversion to Judaism might look at and gain a whole different perspective. But
Mhm.
then at the end, and I just want to look forward towards the end of this entire process, with whom are we sitting? Who is the other group that we are going to get to know in the
Yeah.
same way that we are appreciative of Emmanuel Acho and any other of the non-Jewish world who is finding out about us? And that sense of reciprocity, I think, is extraordinarily powerful. The fact that it's being modeled so beautifully is something that I think should goad us to continue this type of conversation with others as well.
What I'd like to add in terms of who are we having these conversations with an eye towards moving forward from here, I like to remind people is that this book came to pass because Emmanuel approached Noah and said, tell me about yourself. And he had no expectation of anything in return. And that is the true definition of allyship. When you take on someone's issues as though they are your own with no expectation of anything in return. The most effective way to ultimately protect ourselves is to protect other people as well, and for them to become part of this joint initiative to, protect all the values and things that we stand for as well. And so that allyship, even though it might feel very difficult to put aside the things that we need initially, help everybody. It raises all the boats.
There are times when I certainly have that sense in me that reaching out and being a good citizen brings that good citizenship back. There are times when I have had questions about that and some of those ideas, and they've been very disquieting. I still fundamentally believe it. It feels like it's like even a little more complex today, but I'm willing to be in that pool where I still want to be reaching out and gaining understanding of others and being able to have truthful dialogues. And
Mhm.
that's one thing I think the real power of this book and in the interfaith organization that Ara and I are both a part of. One of the things that we're trying to do is to not just have the nice conversations with one another, but to have the uncomfortable conversations where we say, I love my tradition. I feel like this is inspired in some way, but here's a part where, I struggle with as well. And here's how I make sense of that. And I think that
Mhm.
being able to be both proud and self-reflective and self-critical, but confident, I think that is a place of strength that we can come from as a people. And I think starting from clear, well researched answers is a good starting point from which we can gain confidence. And it just feels like a gift that Noah and Emmanuel and you have given us. And we can find all of Rachel's books on rachelholtzman.com, where you have your website and the many books that you've worked on, wonderful cookbooks and some wonderful books on kind of trying to live a life with wisdom, which is certainly part of what we are trying to help our members and ourselves to do as well. Rachel, any final thoughts that you would want to leave us with, or anything that would be a nice way to end?
So much gratitude to both of you for having me on. I could talk about this book all day. It was such a highlight of not just my professional life, but certainly my personal life. I'll say this: when I came to this project, I was raised a Reconstructionist, very very Reform Jew. I grew up in a place that was 98% Jewish in the suburbs of Chicago. So being a Jew was just sort of in the stew. It wasn't something that felt religious to me necessarily. And working on this book filled in so many blanks in my own understanding of what my heritage and also legacy are. And it really cemented, I think you'll both appreciate this. I went to one of the advising rabbis and I said, Noah identifies sort of as a cultural Jew. How can we talk about that? And he said, I understand completely this feeling that there's so many things in this like Jewish stew where just by association we feel Jewish. But he said, Judaism is a religion. And those traditions and practices out of the context of Judaism aren't necessarily a legacy that links us back in that chain thousands of years. And it really made me pause and re examine what my responsibility is as a parent in terms of what I'm passing down to my children. And it's so easy, especially as the parent to young children, to just assume that they are learning these lessons through osmosis, through the stew. And it made me very intentional in terms of what my education is of them now that I have this education of self. And so that's been really very satisfying to me and also to them. They know now how to really position themselves in the world in terms of this incredible light that they carry and the importance of that and nurturing that. I'm also the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. To be able to just fill in those blanks and be able to have this well-rounded story of self, which then that's a gift I can give my children. And that to me feels like if there's one thing that this book allows for someone because we carry that with us into all of our dealings in the world. That becomes innate to who we are and how we talk about ourselves and how we allow ourselves to be talked to and about. So this is more than just us. This is generations to come. And I feel so much gratitude to anyone who chooses to open the cover of this book or listen to it in the audio version, because you're joining the ranks of people who are doing some very important work and some really necessary work for all of us.
What would you want people to do? In other words, if they read the book, they internalize the information, which is terrific. What else would you want them to do after having read this book?
And that's layered. There doesn't necessarily have to be this imperative to go and do. I think that call will come. It could be in the form of someone says something that doesn't sit quite right and they're prepared to speak to, that actually doesn't feel really safe to me. And here's why, because they understand the historical context for that. But I think that there's this real base level of when we show up in sort of the fullest embodiment of our Jewish identity, when we can just exist as Jews, but with the volume turned up just a little bit so that people are aware that they share community space with Jews. Right now, for anyone who feels like I'm not like called to be a anti-Semitism warrior, then that's really all you need to do. And it's not a small thing and it does take effort, but it's as simple as, don't hide your Judaica, your jewelry when you're out. And yes, we have to assess now, unfortunately, where there are safe and less safe spaces to do it. But my findings and my understanding of the world are that the people who wish us harm are so much fewer than the people who don't. The more we make relationships and show up in our fully realized Jewish identity, that is creating more of a buffer from the people who have that, deeply seated anti-Jewish, anti-Israel sentiment than if you felt inclined to take it a step further and engage someone in a conversation and ask them, maybe it's someone in your family who's not Jewish, hey, would you mind reading this book? And we can just read it in parallel and we don't even need to talk about it. We don't have to be beating that drum in a really public, loud way necessarily, but in our own orbits and our own experiences, we become really powerful ambassadors of that experience.
Rachel Holtzman, thank you so much for sharing everything that you've brought to this conversation, into the book, into giving us something to aspire to as we learn this material and engage at whatever level of depth we're willing to. We greatly appreciate it from both of our congregations. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you both. This was really special. I appreciate it.